Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're so pleased that you could join us today for the Our Town Creative Placemaking Technical Assistance Workshop on easy and useful evaluation tools. My name is Maya Herring. I am the Our Town Specialist with the National Endowment for the Arts, and I am so pleased to be here with you all on behalf of the National Endowment. Just want to reiterate how special and unique this program is within the NEA. In this space, we are so lucky to be in partnership with LISC and the incredible resource team. We will get to hear from two folks today from the resource team as well as grantee, and work through some of what's going on in their project and how they're going to tell their story using evaluation tools and methods. And just want to thank all of you again for being here and for engaging with us in this space. You are part of an incredible cadre of folks that are working in their communities, and we just want to be here to support your work in whatever way we can. So with that, I want to turn it over to Melissa Kim with LISC.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Kim, Director of the Creative Placemaking Technical Assistance Program and Director of Community Impact at LISC. I'm joined here with my fellow resource team member, Margie Waller. And we have a fantastic session planned for you today with resource team members, Dr. Susanna Laramie-Kidd and Dr. Tasha Golden, as well as representatives from the Our Town grantee, Emory University, their Praise House project team. So this workshop is part of a series of offerings from the Our Town Technical Assistance Program, including one-on-one consultations, monthly office hours, peer exchanges, and workshops. And as we get into today, wanted to offer these community guidelines to help all of us strive towards a welcoming and affirming convening. First, we invite you to change your name if you so choose by going into the upper right-hand corner of your little screen. Feel free to change your name and add your pronouns. Second, closed captioning is available. So if you'd like to turn on closed captioning, please go to the bottom of your screen where you see the 3 dots and it says More, and select Show Subtitle. Next, the session will be recorded, and we're going to share it out on the LISC NEA Creative Placemaking website. If you don't wish to be recorded, please turn off your video and mute yourself. And the last couple points we'll just talk about together. We want to hear from, so we're all here to learn and connect with each other. So we encourage you to listen deeply, make no assumptions, and most importantly, use the chat. There will be ample time for Q&A, and feel free to ask questions throughout. And we can start using the chat by saying hi. Please, we invite you right now to write your name and where you're zooming in from. And perhaps one word describing how you're entering the space today. And as you think about your location, we wanted to offer in the chat a link to this map maintained by Native Land Digital. It's an important reminder that the place we call home first belonged to Indigenous people. We encourage you to visit the website to learn about the lands you inhabit. And now that's enough of housekeeping. I am going to pass it off to Dr. Tasha Golden.
Hey, thank you so much, Melissa. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you nod if you see this okay? Y'all see this slide? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Like she said, my name is Tasha Golden. I direct research for the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and I'm adjunct faculty in the Center for Arts and Medicine at the University of Florida, and also get to spend a lot of my time working and consulting with folks like you all. So I'm really glad to be here. And I wanted to start here because it informs so much of my work. Every day I get to bridge these fields of public health and the arts as a health researcher and professional, but I also bridge these fields professionally as both an artist and a public health scientist. So I was a touring songwriter for a lot of years. A lot of those years I was independent songwriter, so I had to figure out things like press and media, how to sell the work in a lot of ways while making what still mattered to me and was authentic to me. And I also had songs about topics that were important to me as an activist, like mental health or intimate partner violence. So I had to learn how to use the media and the press for the music in a way that could help educate and raise awareness. And that background really crept into the picture when I founded Project Uncaged, a trauma-informed creative writing program for incarcerated girls. Before I founded this program, a similar initiative had invited me to be a writer in residence. And I noticed that they published books of the poetry that young people created while they were incarcerated, but they only ever published those books for the participants themselves. They never tried to do anything with advocacy or activism around issues. But I knew that gender equity was a problem in juvenile justice, that the voices of girls and gender nonconforming youth remained underheard in a system designed for cis boys. So if you're going to publish a book of girls' poems, why not make sure that it goes far and wide, right? With, as far and wide as possible, with their permission, of course, or at least send it to regional decision makers like judges or city council members, probation officers, the mayor's office, state legislators. So when I started Project Uncaged, that's what we did. We sent out books to all these people with policy briefs or advisory notes about what they could do to respond to girls' voices. We also did public events and got local press coverage. All of that is just to say that now, as a researcher and an evaluator, I'm really informed by that identity as a career artist and as the founder of an arts-based nonprofit. And my experience with those things in storytelling and publicity and persuasion, like what does it take to get people interested in something, to get people committed to something, to get people to be willing to invest in it or to act and show up in response to something. As an academic, I do know that some of that has to do with peer-reviewed research. And I also know there's a lot more to it, right? Like there's the word evidence. Evidence can mean a lot of things, and capturing your impact can mean a lot of things. So before we dive into some initial ideas, I wanted to ask you all this question. You're already doing so much in the chat, so we're just going to add to it. What is your why? In just a few words, why do you do what you do? And that's specifically about this program. You got grant funding, that's why you're here on this call, like not just what do you do in your life, but what do you do? Why are you doing this specific thing? If that question is hard for you, then answer, what do you hope people get out of it? What are you trying to do with your program? Any of these questions that you want to answer, one of these three, will give you like 40 more seconds to drop some of that in the chat so we can hear from y'all. Thanks, Evie. Authentic community engagement, permanent change, adding meaning and value, connecting, creating new opportunities for people. Keep them coming. Historic preservation, helping people design the types of communities they want, improving quality of life. Thank you. Happiness and understanding. Honoring histories, connecting community members, especially when they wouldn't otherwise. Yeah. Thank you. Please keep these coming. I wanted to start here because it can be inspiring to see other people's motivations. Like, why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? And it can also be really grounding if we're going to start talking about evaluation kinds of things, which is what we're about to do. So our whys are where any good evaluation really begins. And so a bit of perspective or framing for this, that evaluation doesn't have to feel like it's this weird external thing that you have to graft onto your process. There's a why behind evaluation, and it has to do with the why behind your work itself. I mentioned earlier that the program that led me to create Project Uncaged made books of poems by incarcerated youth, but they only ever made enough to give to the participants themselves. And they were beautiful books, but that organization saw itself as being mainly about offering something inside the four walls of a jail. And they saw the books as kind of like just a way to kind of honor participants' completion of those workshops. And all of that is great. But my brain immediately had a much vaster idea of what that writing program could be or do, especially not just for the participants, but in order to elevate those participants' voices and concerns and leadership throughout the entire community, and maybe even adjusting policy and resources for them. So often what I tell clients now is that what keeps things small for us as arts organizations or arts programs, or what keeps our communications or our evaluations uninspired and small, is not usually budget, and it's not usually the size of your organization, like we don't have much or we're just really small, we can't do what other people can do. Usually the difference between the two is just imagination. What do you think you're doing? So I wanted to pose this question. This is just for you. This is not to drop in the chat, but how might you be thinking small? And this isn't a judgment like, oh, dang, I suck for thinking small. It's just like, just like, let it be inspiring. Like, how might you be thinking small? And some sub questions to that, like, what do you imagine the purpose of your work is? How might you be thinking small as far as that goes? Who do you think is interested in what you do? How might that be a little small right now? What are the stories and angles and possibilities that you see in your work? What are the hooks for press, for example? Who might be interested in hearing what you're doing? And if you think, well, I'm not thinking small, I'm just thinking realistically, or this is just what I do, that is the value of being in a cohort like this with other people to bounce ideas off of. And it's also the value of connecting with us, I hope, to help you see your work in a new way. So when it comes to evaluation, we conduct evaluations in order to be able to answer questions. And really the main point of an evaluation is usually to tell you whether or to what extent you're doing what you set out to do. You might also want to be able to document what's happening so that you can do it again or replicate it in a new place. And oh my God, like, can we learn from what goes well and from the challenges that we face, and can we adapt? And here's where a lot of people think small, like, can we be a model for others who are seeking to do a similar kind of work, maybe a different community? And what might you notice, like what kind of new potential partnerships or new growth opportunities might become apparent through your data collection and evaluation process that you'd never have been able to notice or take up without that process? These are just some of the questions that that evaluation can help address, and you probably wonder about some of these things yourself. So the evaluation process doesn't have to be something that you do just to like appease a funding god or to check a box. Evaluation can be for you, and the sooner that you feel ownership and creativity and interest and imagination around it, the sooner it can unfold into something that really nurtures you and your work. But despite all of this talk about evaluation, I also want to note here at the front end that evaluation is not the only way to capture your project's impact. I'm always happy to talk more about this later or in office hours, but there's media, there's press, storytelling, policy briefs, op-eds. There are so many ways you can tell people what you're up to and how impactful it is. What's different about evaluation in particular is that it's often the way that you find out, like, okay, what are my program's impacts? Is it having an impact at all? And how or for whom is it having an impact? There are a lot of ways to answer that question, and it's usually what evaluation is for. But it's also helpful to open up that process. So evaluation can mean a lot more and be a lot more creative than we often think. A formal evaluation isn't always the most effective way to communicate your impact. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It certainly doesn't mean that you don't have to do it. Like, you may very well have to do a formal evaluation. But the extent to which a formal evaluation is needed, the extent to which it's valued, the extent to which it's actually persuasive to anybody, all of that is always going to depend on your audience and your goals, which leads us to this: what is evidence? What is proof? The quickest answer is that it depends. It depends on who you're talking to and why you're talking to them. Like, if you're talking to me, trying to get me to attend an event that you're putting on, you're going to need to sell me on that somehow, right? To get me to get out of my house and come to your thing. But the threshold of evidence that I might need in order to be interested in attending is going to be different than the threshold of evidence I may need in order to give you thousands of dollars to help you put on that performance, right? That's a different kind of data needed for those two things. And just to throw us all for a loop, the truth is that depending on who I am, the data that may be most persuasive in getting me to donate thousands of dollars to you may just be my own personal experience at your performance. Like, oh, that was amazing, and I want more people to see it. How can I help, right? That may be more persuasive than anything else. So, which is just to say, even when the threshold is high, that doesn't translate automatically into this situation clearly requires a lot of quantitative data, right? So what is the data that's needed? What is evidence? It depends on who you're talking to and what your goals are. But you are going to need to collect data at some point. Probably that's why we are doing this workshop. So if you're going to do that, it's great to start on that first question. Are we doing what we set out to do? And if you're clear on what you're trying to do, which is always, sometimes it's always the first thing and sometimes it's the hardest thing. If you're clear on what you're trying to do, the most obvious way to find out if you're doing it is just to ask the participants. That seems obvious, but it can be hard. Oh, these are both happening at the same time, whatever. Now you have an insight to number 2. So if you're gonna ask the participants, that can be interviews, focus groups, surveys. It can be asking people to create art about their experience or to give testimonials. All of that is data collection. Often it just feels like doing what you do while being humble and participatory enough to elicit feedback and learn about what you're doing. Like if your goal is to help people feel better, then I hope that you're legit curious about whether what you're doing is actually helping people feel better. If your goal is to teach people something about their life or their history, then I hope that you're legit curious about whether their engagement with your work actually taught them anything, right? Like this is fundamental. Your evaluation can be rooted in your own genuine curiosity about your practice. The second one, the organizations I work with often worry about like whether what they do is quantifiable. And often it is, just not in typical ways. And that's why you have people like us to connect with. Like just because you're not sure how to quantify what you do doesn't mean it's not quantifiable. But also, here's the thing, not being able to quantify your work is not an automatic problem. The expectation that you have to have like statistics and numbers actually comes up less often than you might think. And I'll say this, if somebody's requirement is you have to assess the extent to which you're actually doing what you set out to do, and if you interpret it that, you hear that as you have to quantify your work, that interpretation is inaccurate and it's not helpful, and you did it to yourself, right? You don't necessarily have to quantify everything. When you're convinced that you have to, that's when you settle on things like how many people attended, how many pieces of art were produced, and none of that gets to your why. That stuff isn't actually doing anything for you. Okay, so the last one, like we talked about, what is evidence? Like I mentioned, sometimes the proof people need comes in being personally exposed to an experience. That's data, that's evidence. Obviously, there are big exceptions to that. Sometimes different data are required, and in those cases, there are lots of options. And one of them, just to briefly mention, this is another form of data. People in your program create things as part of their engagement, or if they could create things, this may be something to think about. It's something that I research a lot, that art is a form of data. And it may be a better form of data than other research methods. I published about this earlier this year. Like we used creative writing to learn about girls' experiences with violence. It worked better than the surveys that we used. So this can be a great way to collect data. Why? We know that art provides people a safer way to share what's going on with them. It decenters you as a researcher, a data collector. It centers the art. We get different information when people share their experience through art than otherwise. It can improve dissemination, like how public can things go, whose voices are considered. And there's a lot more potential for reciprocity. I don't have time to get into all of this, but I'm happy to answer questions about this later. But just to have in mind, add it to your potential toolkit. Asking people about art is a way to collect data. Don't have time to go through all these questions, but things related to the art and what it can, the insights it can tell you about your program or people's lives. Whether you formulate art as a kind of data or not, either way, we have to demystify the process of evaluation. So evaluations aren't about trying to quantify the unquantifiable, or they're not about reducing art to a formula. They're usually about just answering specific questions. And as artists who see your work as a way to help people, I'm sure that you care about whether you're actually helping them in the way that you set out to, right? So evaluation can be that simple, a way to find out if we're accomplishing what we hope. And we also have to accept the limitations, like okay, so first, when conducting an evaluation, you'll have to choose specific aims. You'll probably never be able to share all the ways your program can possibly help any human, right? And not everybody who's interested in your program is going to care equally about all the same things. So you might have a funder who really cares about like one thing that you do to the complete exclusion of everything else that you do that you care about. That's not necessarily a problem. Like your goal in that case would be to communicate what the funder needs to know about the thing they care about, and then communicate about the rest of your awesomeness to all the other people who are likely to care about it, right? Nothing's gone wrong there. You don't only have one audience, you have lots of potential audiences. That said, like I mentioned, different types of data work for different kinds of audiences. So it's never going to be which approach is right or best. It's always going to be which approach is needed for the particular purpose and the particular audience. If you want to create something great, you have to know your own why. You have to know who you want or need to communicate about that why with, and then you have to figure out what would count as evidence for them regarding that why. There's a lot of ways to do this. I have a blog series with worksheets that's free that you can access on my site. I can link to that if somebody else doesn't hear. But this is a really simple way to get started. Like, think about your audience. Remember that you have lots of them. It's never just your funder. They're an obvious one, but they're just one. There's lots of people who may want to know about what you do. So don't think small about your audience. Once you know your audience, what do they care about? And how does that connect with what you're doing? What do they already care about in their lives? And how does what you do connect with that? Where are they? What do they read? What do they look at, pay attention to? What do they give credence to? And that tells you where you would need to show up in order to make sure they see or hear your message. And then what kinds of deliverables or press or reports are best suited for that particular audience? Are they going to read a report? Are they going to watch a documentary? What are they going to look at that's actually going to share about what you do with them? I'm going to wrap it up there, but what I hope you take away from this section, and Suzanne is going to tell you a lot more and get a little more granular with you. What I hope you take away is that there are many ways to capture your impact. There are a lot of ways to conduct an evaluation, and there are a lot of non-evaluation ways to share your impact as well. The choices that you make about how to do this depend on your why, they depend on your audiences, they depend on why you're communicating with those audiences. So just stay curious and imaginative. We want to help you conduct an evaluation, but we also want to help stimulate that creativity and imagination of yours around this process, not just around the program that you're running itself. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass it off to Susanna.
Hello, everyone. I'm sharing, just getting my slides up. Excited to be here with you today and excited to be sharing this space with Tasha and with the Emory Praise House project. And so I just wanted to give you just a brief background for me, that my academic background is a PhD in anthropology of religion and literature and gender. And so I come to this work with a real interest in people, but also how they experience everything that we do as in the arts, but also how we make meaning and what the sort of social processes around the work that we do. So it's one of those things that that background gives me also this real love of the field work part of this work, but I also love teaching and coaching other people to do this work too. So I'm really excited to share some tips that of how to sort of the nuts and bolts of how to get started. So I love this graphic because it's actually just a sort of talking about the steps and evaluation in a really broad way, the overview of sort of what all the different things that you do in an evaluation, but also indicating that it's a cycle, right? That you can kind of enter any point in this the cycle, wherever you are in your project. It's never too late to think about how you're evaluating your impact and how you're evaluating the processes and what you do. But the first steps are always, to really connect with everybody, like Tasha was saying, understand who is going to use the impact that, the evidence of impact that you're gathering. And then we'll talk today about a little bit about that, but also how you describe what you're doing and how you get to that place of creating an evaluation plan or the evaluation design. We're not going to get into the nuts and bolts as much of the gathering evidence, but again, I really love what Tasha was saying about how evidence can mean lots of different things. And once you figure out why what you're going to use the evaluation for and create that plan, then the evidence part actually is easier, right? To figure out like what you need to answer those questions. And then, you are going to synthesize the evidence that sort of do that, you know, we might call that analysis, but it's really the sense making of the evidence that you have, and then figuring out how you're going to communicate that out to the people who it matters to. And again, as Tasha was saying, the communication part is super key. I mean, what makes it different than research is that or more sort of academic research is that you're doing this so that you can use it, so that you can learn, so that you can communicate with the people that you are trying to bring on board, or the people who are involved and impacted by your work. So, and I'm just, again, reiterating what Tasha was saying as well, that there are formal evaluation processes, and then there are, on the other end of it, something that we might call reflection or evaluative thinking, or things just really where you're sitting down and thinking about what is my impact and how do I know if I'm on the right track. And so on the reflection end of it, you might not actually be doing more formal data collection. That's still evaluation, that's still evaluative thinking. And all of these steps that we're talking about today are still necessary, and it's still the way you get to that really more critical thinking about your impact. Even if you're not going to do something more on the way formal end of it is like a pre-post kind of data collection where you're, you know, collecting a baseline of data before your intervention, and then collecting data after your intervention and measuring the change, right? That's like a really formal, really social scientific method of doing evaluation. Sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes you have the resources for that. But there's a huge range, and just always encourage you to remember that it's still important to do the reflection, the critical thinking, and the planning, even if you decide, oh, we don't actually need, as Tasha was saying, we don't actually need, you know, population level data, or, you know, anything that's like super large numbers of something that seems rigorous, right? But that's the reality, is the rigor comes from the thinking part of it. And then you saw in that diagram, the first thing is to really map out all the people who are involved in your project, and thinking about how they might need to be involved in an evaluation process, but also how they might use an evaluation process, how they're impacted by your programs. So mapping the people and organizations involved is the first step, absolute first step, and figuring out how you might need to engage them. But I also feel like this is a place where I first start mapping impact when I'm working with people I'm coaching, is really looking at, okay, so I need to know who you're connecting to, because I need to know, then we can start to map how you might be impacting them, or how you might, or how they're contributing to your goals and the impact that you're trying to have. So figuring that people map and organizational map is the first thing. And also in this first phase, this is where you're probably centering equity in your project, but in your thinking process, in your evaluation process, is also where you're thinking about, even in your evaluation, who's participating in the evaluation, I would say, who's deciding what matters, who's deciding what evidence, whose voice matters in the process. And something that I always just, it's something we sometimes forget, but the time and insights of everyone involved should be compensated. So it's sort of a baseline. I don't even consider that equity. It's sort of like baseline of non-extractive research or an evaluative process. So this is where you start thinking about equity, but you're going to be thinking about it all throughout your process as well. And then after you've done that sort of pre-work is actually what might feel like the main work that Tasha was saying, is what is the why are you doing the work that you're doing, but what specifically and in very concrete ways are you hoping to see as a result of your work? what will success look like? And this is like almost like a future casting kind of exercise. And it just being very, very concrete, like if we're successful, what will it look like? And then as you're thinking about that, sometimes it's really complex, right? We're all doing these place-based projects where we're talking about lots of systems and structures, and so as you're thinking about that change you're hoping to see, this is also where you start again that sort of equity question. But how do you understand your actions within the structures and systems that create outcome disparities? So when you're thinking about what outcomes you want, you also have to think about, okay, well, what might be the barriers for us getting there to what we want, and what are the things that we can't control that are factors in our process? I always love these. I'm going to show two sort of frameworks that you might, sometimes it's hard for us to actually articulate what we want to see, right? You know, sometimes it's, I think I've been conditioned to think that sometimes our arts interventions are, you know, not quantifiable, like Tasha was saying, but they are measurable. And I think it's all about finding the language and articulating and being concrete about what the change that we're trying to see. So this framework from Animating Democracy can be really helpful as you're just trying to think about what are the kinds of reasonable outcomes for us to expect from an arts intervention. And obviously these are very general, and your project will have much more specific language, but it's something to think about. These are the categories, and if you're struggling to come up with those concrete outcomes, then this kind of framework can help you think through, maybe this is actually what we're going for. And then this framework, also from Animating Democracy, I find really useful by looking at it the other end of things, that often we forget to actually assess our artistic or our aesthetic goals. And I think it's important to articulate them, to really say that this is why I've chosen to this kind of artistic intervention. This is why I've chosen something more aesthetic in this way. And this might also be about relationships. So I saw some of those examples in the chat of community engagement being the things that you're really looking for. And these are sometimes the kinds of artistic outcomes that can really come from quality arts-based community engagement, kind of openness, or a kind of emotional experience. These are ways, other language that might be really emphasizing the aesthetic part of your project, and really emphasizing how the aesthetic part of your project is supporting maybe the more social or the more like social change oriented outcomes that you are looking for. So this is also, so this is just a tool to help you think through some of those. I think I'm running a little bit long, so I'm going to just go through this quickly. I was talking about those systems, talking about how our actions operate in systems, and thinking through that. Sometimes when you're just driving your impact to this stage, you can build something called a theory of change or a logic model. And I'm using this example because this is what I built in Los Angeles County for a graffiti abatement, public art and programming work at parks and libraries. And it was just to show that it can be really basic. It doesn't have to be a really elaborate diagram, because I mean the systems we're operating in are really complex, but just having a way to sort of map out in a simple way how your actions will lead to change that you want to see. Sometimes it can be helpful to map that in a diagram. And then you just make a plan. It all sounds simple, but we're talking about describing your impact. You write out your goals and your hoped for outcomes. And then we're going to walk through this process in a minute with the Praise Houses project. So I won't spend too much time talking about it, but the next step, when you have articulated the goals and the hoped for outcomes in your project, the next step is to develop indicators that you have reached your outcomes. So what will it look like? What are those signs that you have been successful? And then you make a plan to collect the evidence for your how you will know of those indicators, you've reached those indicators. And then, as we mentioned, decide how you will share your findings, and that may influence the kind of evidence that you want to collect, because you might want to have certain other kinds of evidence there. And then quickly, methods to consider. The first one I always say is that you documenting your project, through photos, notes, video. That's always the best. I mean, it's great. It's really important, and actually can be the best evidence for once you've decided what your indicators are, then that more kind of open-ended documentation can be really, really useful in providing that evidence. You can use surveys, you can use interviews, focus groups, meetings, discussions. Participant observation is essentially having somebody taking notes. That's simply what that is, but it can be a little bit more structured than that if you need it to be, having a sort of template for different kinds of events and things like that. And then, as Tasha was saying, there are many, many, many artist-led and arts-based methods that can give you much better evidence most of the time. So those can be whatever fits into your project. And then one last note here, my other end of it is always stepping back. If you're thinking about using a survey, step back and think about whether or not that's the right tool for what you are the evidence that you're trying to gather. I think we think it's easy to build a survey on one level, but it's it's very difficult to get good information from a survey. And so the question is it the right tool? Is it quantifiable? Is it appropriate for a written or digital format? Surveys are self-administered, right? People just answer questions on their own, and if it's not appropriate for a written or digital format, you have to have somebody asking the question, which is a additional, it's additional labor that you may have to make sure that you have. And will it be a burden to participants? So many of the communities that we're working in, and pretty much everybody in our modern world, is over surveyed. And if it's challenging to even take the time to fill out a survey, don't do it, right? There's probably a better way to do it, probably a better way to make it fun. And because of all of these things about doing a survey, if you will not get enough responses to really build a good evidence, or build the evidence that you want, then it's not the right tool, right? It's very hard to get enough responses to make it a useful exercise. So I'm not saying never use a survey. I use surveys all the time, but you have to be very careful about whether it's the right tool, and that there are many, many other things that might be a better use for everyone's time. So I think that's all I have. And so I think our next step is to bring Charmaine Minifield into this conversation, and very excited to just introduce a little bit the Emory Praise House project a little bit, and then we'll get into the sort of evaluation planning part of this. So Charmaine Minifield is the artist and director for the Praise House project. Her work explores African American history, memory, and ritual as an intentional pushback against erasure. And for a much better bio and more information about her, there's a link in the chat. So we're just going to jump ahead into talking about the project itself. So thank you, Charmaine, for being here today. I just wanted to note that, you know, for today, we're talking about one specific site for the Praise Houses project. There are multiple locations for its complex. We all have very complex projects, but today we're talking about the Beacon Hill installation in Decatur, Georgia, of the Praise House. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Charmaine, I'd love for you to just tell us, what will the Praise House installation be like? So what is it?
Good afternoon, everyone, nationwide. It's such a pleasure to be here. The Praise House project is it's a replica of a small wooden structure that were called praise houses that we placed in and we built in secret safe spaces during enslavement. They were some of our first churches. We would gather in praise houses and stand in circle and sing and call and response. And the circle of us would move counterclockwise. And that tradition is called the ring shout. And that actual movement and dance practice is evidence of our identity out of West African cultural ceremonies and celebrations. So we use the ring shout as a central totem or idea in communities of remembrance against resistance against erasure. The idea of remembering yourself and your identity at a moment or in the face of erasure. The first praise house was at Oakland Cemetery, Atlanta's historically segregated cemetery. It lifted up the memories of 879 who were displaced out of the original slave square over into a flooded zone. And we lost them in a mass grave in 1866 by order of the Atlanta City Council. We found them again in 2016 through heat sensing radar technology. And the Praise House project sat there on that newly restored African-American burial ground for 3 weeks then. And when you walk inside, it's of the Praise House, it really becomes an immersive digital installation. We work with digital media artists, musicians to create a sound score and installation that emanates from the inside of the Praise House over the land of the African-American burial grounds. We also invited audiences through Flux Projects, was our initial presenter. And now we've received this funding to be able to replicate the experience in 3 other communities is our target here in Atlanta. We're going to Beacon Hill first, which we'll be talking about today, and lifting up the story of Beacon Hill, which is a Black town that was removed. And now one of the most high rent, exclusive districts in our metro area, downtown Decatur, recently also removed their Confederate monument. So we're lifting up the story of Beacon Hill right there in downtown Decatur. My alma mater, Agnes Scott, is a stone's throw from away, and that's where the employees of Agnes Scott lived. And these are descendants of those who were enslaved by the president of Agnes Scott, who migrated here with him from Florida. The next will go to Southview Cemetery that will honor the African-American history of Atlanta and the civil rights history, but also acknowledge the 1906 race massacre. And that'll be in South Atlanta. And we're inviting reinvestment in that community and creating programming in partnership with the local CDC down there around affordable housing. Then we're going as resistance and a response and an act of repair for the 1906 race massacre. Then we're going to Emory. And we're acknowledging Emory's role in slavery and dispossession. And every one of these sites, we have a whole set of community partners, a whole different set of program focus and goals. And obviously we're tailoring our evaluation process. Thank you, Susanna. I'm so happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
We want to affect change
Mhm.
in these communities by lifting up and preserving these Black narratives. The work centers historic preservation, but addresses issues of erasure, past, present, and future potential for Black narratives. And we're activating our entire metro community, municipal partners to higher education, and we're looking at the story of a city, a Southern city, and at the moment of emancipation, and how those fundamental elements of our history affect the identity of our city today. Our goal is to continue the Praise House Project nationally and have multiple sites. We're even building this one as a modular to test that, to tour these metro area sites with the hope that we can install one eventually at the Chattahoochee Brick Company, which is the privately owned prison that used convict labor to reconstruct the South. So we're really looking at like affecting change by just recalling Black narratives in public spaces and inviting those conversations. And one of our evaluations says difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Our partner is a difficult conversation. So
Yeah.
That's the Praise House Project.
Thank you, Charmaine. So I think, so what we're going to do is I should have said probably before that, so as the resource team member, I've been working with the Praise House Project to work on their evaluation plan. So everything I just discussed. And so we're going to bring Dr. Candy Tate, who's a historic preservationist and part-time senior program coordinator of community engagement for Emory Arts at Emory University. So she's managing the NEA grant for the Praise House Project and generally being awesome in this project. So we excited to have both Charmaine and Dr. Candy talking through a worksheet that we've been working on together, and we're going to continue working on it together today. And also we'll bring back Tasha to join our conversation as we sort of workshop in real time. Obviously, we've done some pre-work to start filling out this worksheet, but this is still a work in progress. So we wanted to show you that sort of what it looks like in process to be working out an evaluation plan. So Charmaine, do you want to talk through these? So the first goal, so the first goal that we have is about creating a multimedia immersive Praise House installation that promotes awareness of Black narratives, specifically the lives of those who lived in Beacon Hill, and helps people feel connected to this place and the community that lived here, and feel inspired and to remember and resist erasure going forward. So tall scale, but that's the first goal.
We, in our process, Susanna and I, we met twice. Once we had to acknowledge the need to measure the project for the hopes of, just listening to y'all's presentation earlier and reflecting on our conversation, Susanna, how we had to decide who we're measuring this work for. Are we measuring it for future sites and future communities? Are we measuring it for funders in hopes to capture our efficiency with how we execute the project and the impact in the community? And are we measuring it for the community directly? Those were some of the contributing factors of how we considered how we wanted to hone in on measurable outcomes. And this one, it basically describes the goal of the project as we'd like to see it happen in the Beacon Hill community. And the Beacon Hill community, so let me give you a little history, it sits on land that has been whittled away It was land that was deeded to a man at his emancipation, and then by his owner and father. And he eventually sold small lots to Black families. It became a Black business, burgeoning business in residential district. But FDR, urban renewal program or something came through and leveled all the shotgun houses and made it into a public housing community. Those families were displaced and broken up if they wanted to stay on their land. Some of the families that were in that initial displacement, they still have ties to this land. Eventually, the land, it became now it is the center of the Decatur School Board. They own the land, but there is a lot that the Praise House will sit on that's still in discussion of how it will be developed. It is a rare space of green space, spot of green space in the land. So with this goal, placemaking goal, we wanted to bring attention to the lives of those who lived in Beacon Hill. In the work, we feel like if we lift up Black narratives in community in a way that reflects on history to center it as important, then it creates a value for that space, to hold space for those Black narratives to continue to both, be preserved, but also activated for, and the legacy residents in particular, to have a say about the future of that space.
Yeah, thanks. So, Ali, can you scroll down to the next goal? So the second goal is like embedded in all of what Charmaine is saying. Is the second goal was about making the case for and laying the foundation for the preservation of local Black histories by collecting and preserving oral histories and artifacts from local Black community members, particularly from Beacon Hill residents, their descendants. So it's a big part of the goal. This is a really important goal as well. And you can just see some of the outcomes that we've started sketching here about, actually how many are collected, but also the future plans around historic preservation that the local partners are making. Can you scroll to the next goal too? So, and then we have what we wanted, the third goal is what we want it to actually feel like for those who are participants, particularly for Black participants, to instill a sense of pride and cultural identity for Black people, and specifically for Black people who are descendants of the Beacon Hill community. So that sense of validation and pride in telling their story, but in the other programs, which were centered on dance and lots of other cultural traditions specifically to the Black community in this area, then also having a sense of pride and belonging. And then if you could scroll to the last.
I want to interject.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that goal is, to me, in response to the removal of the Confederate monument. And
you can scroll back, sorry, to the goal 3.
Forming of, a collective contemporary identity of that community. And I just wanted to point out that goal was specifically targeted to what is ultimately the effect of removing a Confederate monument.
Right, and lifting up a counter narrative, yes. Right.
In a way.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Candy.
I'd love to share that, a lot of the housing authorities in the area have erased projects, and what we title as projects were communities for Black and Brown people. And we didn't call them projects, it was home. And so the home house might be a shotgun house or an apartment, but we need to, again, reclaim that narrative of these ghost communities. And even though the physical structures were torn down, I have research assistants who have shared that they have a community on Facebook, so they still keep in touch, and celebrate graduations and birthdays and all of the things that a community does, even though they're not physically able to go back and look at where they grew up.
Yeah, that's really important to note that the community, is still there, even though it has been displaced, right? It doesn't stop existing just because you moved people out. So let's move to the fourth goal, and we're going to spend more time here. That's why I'm kind of like rushing through the other goals, because we want to talk about this goal and do a little bit more workshopping here. So the fourth goal was to invite the institutional partners for this site. We're specifically talking about the Beacon Hill site, where Agnes Scott College, the city of Decatur, and DeKalb County are the sort of big institutional partners who are involved in helping to bring the Praise House to this site, and also and some of the programming around it, partnering and co-hosting programming. And so the institutional partners, the goal is to invite them into uncomfortable conversations, to acknowledge and sit with the history of this community, and to consider their own relationships to Beacon Hill and their ongoing practices of erasure that have contributed to this community being displaced. And this goes to your point, Charmaine, as well, about the Confederate monument just being removed nearby. This is like larger community, and how are these narratives being have been actively erased, and what are the next steps for these powerful partners. So we started talking about, so Candy, do you want to talk through some of these outcomes that we're really hoping for with these more institutional partners?
And certainly, as we look at DeKalb County and the city of Decatur, again, there are also large institutions that Emory works with. So the idea of there is actually a department in Emory University for governmental relations. We've been looking at how we can sit down and have these conversations. And I will say also, as we think about, partnerships and the removal of Confederate monuments, there are communities that is their history. And so how can we have a conversation with them about their pride and ownership in that history, as we also lift up our African-American stories that may not be part of the Praise House project, but certainly the art history department at Emory has done a workshop around Confederate monuments and their artistic validity, but we also have this heavy history that we have to contend with as well. Help me out, what's the next?
Yeah. Right.
All while addressing or acknowledging the history, like the Daughters of the Confederate, who placed the monuments there, who have deep history with Agnes Scott. Those are all partners to this project. And Emory University, being another institution of higher learning very nearby, the inhabitants of Beacon Hill also were connected to Emory University. And then how do we look at the history of this community and the disparity that has existed as a result of these practices of erasure over generations to the present. And African-American pride is not in any way lacking. As such, it is even more resilient because of these acts of erasure. And there's so many tidbits in history, the burning of a church, when MARTA came in, public transportation came in, that was on the path of the MARTA train, those kinds of things. And so we're hoping that we could pull these institutional partners to sustain a participation across, constituencies, and this is where Susanna was challenged us to sort of break it down to how can we measure success, or how can we measure the effects of the project on these topics and in these spaces?
Right.
And I smile and think, if we can get them to the table, and as you're saying, photographing and documenting and just sometimes it's as easy as breaking bread, that we might be able to approach some of these very difficult conversations. Charmaine, share the fundraising roundtable we had at the Carlos Museum.
So we also have in Atlanta some recent history of exposing redlining in the philanthropic community. Here, our community foundation was called out by the Black arts community. And it was a whole movement, and the Atlanta Regional Commission supported the research of the disparity in giving practices across the field to show that only 2% on the last 35 years had gone to Black-run organizations. So, the racism within philanthropy and as a tool to uphold white supremacy in the South is on the table. And so we called a gathering, and in that gathering, there were some interesting folks in the room, including those who were representing the Fuqua family, who was the family who owned my family. And we're hoping to create a whole element of oral histories that collects a conversation between those who enslaved my family. And we're asking this collective of private foundations to support the project, but to consider their own narratives and their own role and historical role, but also owning their identity in the present. And we did that in sort of a pseudo ring shout in a gathering that we had at Emory. We invited everyone to tell a personal story, and it went around the table. And one woman came back and said, I have to acknowledge that I've been sitting in white privilege. I didn't want to tell the whole story, but the truth is I grew up in a big white house with only Black servants. And those are the only people of color that I knew, and for her to say that in the room, it shifted everybody to go ahead and to be honest with themselves in that story. So the project for me invites those uncomfortable conversations into a safe space like the Praise House did before, and allows people to share themselves, their actual truth, their actual identity, like the ring shout did before. And it gives people the construct to be able to then potentially envision equity forward within that gathering setting. So that's what the ring shout, that's what the Praise House was before. It was this, portal of infinite possibilities, and it was prayer and faith practices. And so anyway, all of that, I don't want to belabor the conversation, but that is what framed our discussion of how do we measure? How do we measure? How do we drop this into this chart, intended outcomes? Right. And Susanna,
I think
everyone's seen the very conversations we had,
Right. But I think that it really is a really good example of what Tasha was saying about like the why, the why of this project is so deep and important, and that articulating that and articulating what that's going to look like is the real, is a challenge when it's like, it's hard, right? It's hard. But then what some of these methods for data collection that I've suggested are really just documentation, right? Saying like, we had this meeting and this is the way it went, right? It's like to have those kinds of notes. And if you can scroll down just for a second to the next row. Yes. Yeah. So like seeing what it would look like if, as the institutions are acknowledging this, right? This is a documentation of like public statements or institutional, press releases, things that people say to the press, like all these things that are actually evidence for this kind of change or this more institutional shift. And then if you scroll down just a little bit more to the last one, this is where it might get a little bit different for each partner, and where we say acknowledging their own institutional relationship to these histories and how they might make a decision to make, you know, towards equity, and specifically the Beacon Hill community, in the considering that the history of the Beacon Hill community in their future decision-making, programming, or resource allocation. It might, this is where when you're looking at those outcomes, it might be very different for each institutional partner, you know, about whether, you know, what's going to happen with this land that the Praise House is on installation on, right? It's undeveloped, it's owned by the City of Decatur Schools, you know, that those kinds of questions, how that comes up in these future conversations. So that you might be looking for something different for each partner, but you're really still looking for similar kinds of shifts in commitments. So yeah, Dr. Candy, you had
Dr. Candy.
Yes, yeah, and it's, you know, and as I'm hearing us talk, and I don't want the purpose of the Praise House to be lost in these big institutional things that we want to accomplish, but most importantly is community. And so Charmaine immediately wanted to connect this to genealogy and the slave voyages database, so that so many of our people can't go back more than a grandparent, or a great grandparent isn't very unusual. And so we wanted to be able to have a strong oral history and genealogy component to the Praise House. And as we're in community, when we leave and go to the next community, we leave it better than we found it, so that the oral histories that would be collected are then deposited into a, you know, repository of the community. So we're looking at the you know, so the partnership of the DeKalb, is it Decatur or DeKalb? DeKalb History Center is very important to us, to be able to, because they don't have an African-American collection. So if we're bringing community out, bring your photos, bring your, you know, your letters, that we can scan them. We're not asking them to take their objects, but that we can scan and preserve and create that story. And veterans, you know, so where were our African-American veterans in the story? So it is getting expansive, but critical and key to this component of the Praise House is community. So Southview Cemetery will go to Auburn Avenue Research Library, and then when we get to Emory, those oral histories that are collected would then come to Emory's archives. So we've been thoughtful in, as they say, the number of partners may increase, but we've been very intentional about how we want community to look, and outreach, who we will go to. So my connections with sororities and fraternities and the churches and the educational institutions that make up our community, and business owners. So we know that model, wherever we take the Praise House, exists. We started with schools, educating our community, and those we started with churches. So religion is always present in our community, where we're worshiping, and those stories of why we might be Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, Muslim, or other, or non-denominational, or retaining our African culture and history. So all of those stories will be part of some of the questions we're thinking about in the oral history collection. And then from how we worship becomes how we educate, and then how we educate then determines where we go and create business and community. And those businesses then feed back into donating to churches and to projects and causes that we have. And those social and civic organizations are having fundraisers to support the effort of the uplift of our community. So we all have always been about a rising race, and that talented tent helping everyone else, but also using a Booker T. Washington model of skills and trades, so everybody working together is that picture of community, of rebuilding Black Main Street. And that's what my nonprofit is partnering with. Culture Centers International is partnering with the Praise House Project to make sure we paint that picture of progress, on into the future.
Yeah. What you're raising there, Dr. Candy, is so helpful, because like we've seen, you all have access to this worksheet, and we're wanting to look at the Praise House as an example for the rest of you all to think about how you might think about evaluation. You can tell by talking to Charmaine and Dr. Candy that they have lots of goals for this work, and for every single goal there are ways to parse it out. And for every single one of these goals, you can see how we went through goals, and then Dr. Candy is like, yeah, but we do have this most important one, right? Let's not lose sight of community. And community, if we just looked at community as one goal, there would be specific outcomes related to community building. What does that even mean? If the community feels connected, if they know their history, if they're being supported, what specifically does that mean though? And how might we measure that? And what could we use to measure that? And so to help kind of like rein it in for anybody who's watching this and thinking about your own program, you don't have to do an evaluation that evaluates every single goal you've ever had for your program. Praise House is not obligated to do an evaluation for every single one of these 4 goals that's on their worksheet. They don't have to do an evaluation at all. Well, maybe you do for your funder, right? But choose the one that you can either choose the one that you think is most important to you, choose the one that's most important to your participants, your community, or choose the one that's most important to your funders so you can make sure that you can sustain your work, or choose the one that's easiest to get the data for, and that is also going to be persuasive. But you can choose. You don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to do everything. And then also, if you're having a hard time, the goal of this worksheet is to help you start with your goal and then break it down. It's all about breaking it down. And that's going to take some time. And you're going to be like, oh, why do I have to do this? Duh, it's obvious why this is such an awesome program. And we're doing amazing things, and just give us money and help us do it. But you tease it apart, and that's going to be inspiring for you too, to get at those details of what you're trying to do. And a good way to do that is to keep asking yourself why. If I were consulting with Charmaine and Dr. Candy, there's a couple goals in here that I would push them to keep asking why. Because I would, as a quick example, and you don't have to answer this now because you would have brilliant answers.
Tell us.
But what would be the benefit of having people recognize their role in the erasure of history? What are you hoping actually? It's concretely. If an institutional partner, don't answer this now, but if an institutional partner actually acknowledged all of that, what would they do? How would your community benefit? So there's ways to keep going with a why. There are some people who say, if you ask why 5 times, answer it and then say why that, answer it, say why that, or so what. Sometimes answer, so what, answer, so what, answer, so what. If you do that 5 times, you'll get to what you're actually trying to do, right? So that can be a way to get down to it. But if you can distill what you're really setting out to do, asking why and so what can help you. And then remember that you don't have to try to do every single goal. You can start with something small, or start with the first thing. And last thing that I'll add in, you're welcome to ask your community. One of your goals can be to ask the community what the heck they think the goal of this should be. So in Charmaine and Dr. Candy's case, it might be that one of the things they try to do at their Praise House is to ask people, what do you think we should expect of our institutions and our city partners? And let the community tell you what they think the end goal for those institutions should be, right? So you don't have to come up with the goals yourself either. Maybe the first year that your program runs, one of your goals is to find out from your community what their goal for your project is, right? So take it easy, take it piece by piece, and do what you can, and ask for help whenever you need it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That came up with Susanna, and
Yeah.
I thought that could be an interesting, because in the African American tradition, we acknowledge our elders anyway. And so as a part of the project, I wanted to insist on somehow gathering the opinions of our elders. And I was housing it inside of the oral histories component, like literally going to the remaining legacy residents or connected family members and interviewing the elders and asking them that question. Thank you for that. And making that like a concrete task that can be done inside of an evaluation process that can be, documented and measured and then shared in a way that's I think productive for the project forward. And with it, I'm imagining some of that can be done before the Praise House, during the and during the Praise House time on each site to lead up to designing the Praise House even better for the next community, but also maybe leaving that evaluation information in that community to be useful in their work forward of historic preservation, saving space, affecting public policy, things like reparations plans for institutions around higher education and access. Just those are like some of our objectives that we want to see as a result.
And I would add that we realize we're not trying to be experts at everything. And so what partners might we add to this project that are? So for oral histories, the Atlanta branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, does veterans oral histories. And so we're modeling our oral histories from them. The genealogy piece, there is an association, the Afro-American History and Genealogy Society that does this work and is actually helping the National Center for Civil and Human Rights on researching descendants of the 1906 race massacre. So if we have a name, we can help teach and train the community on how they find their ancestors. And again, hopefully to be able to, and again, this is knowing that Emory has this resource and skill set in the slave voyages database. That's the missing piece that everybody has. It's what part of Africa does our family come from? And so Emory would be helpful in all of the Praise House locations in that regard. So we're aligning our work there.
Hi, it's me again. I just wanted to chime in and just advise to start wrapping up so we can just have some time for Q&A. But thank you. This has been a really interesting and exciting conversation that hopefully we can continue during office hours, during one-on-one consultations. So I just wanted to ask folks if they had any final thoughts, like a key takeaway they wanted to share.
I think we can,
and then
also we could just open it up for Q&A, particularly for
that works too. Yeah.
I know that when we talked about it, we said, I do want to share. It was very helpful for me to go through with Susanna and distill down the different columns, the intended outcomes from that goal to the indicators, then to the data and methods. That was very helpful with all of this lofty world changing, social justice impact. We're in the home of Dr. King, that kind of work here in a pivotal time, like removing a Confederate monument, how the nuts and bolts. And so this, I just cannot say that enough that this chart, thank you. I can see, and we filled it in a little bit as well, so.
And I'll advocate for this office hours, because it was in an office hour that we met Susanna, and I inboxed her and said, we need help with evaluation, because I know coming from Emory and what I'm going to have to do as a final report, I'm like, I got an artist, I don't have an evaluator. So what does all this mean of all these disparate parts? So this process was very helpful personally, and said, then NEA came and said, well, what you all are doing and working through, this will help others. So thank you for the office hours, because that's how we landed here.
Folks can always reach us, right, via the consultation form and at office hours. I think that this workshop has been so informative. We went broad, we went deep, we went big, we went small, like so much information. I think one conversation is not enough, right? We need to continue this conversation. Speaking of office hours, the next one is coming up, as you'll see in the chat, November November 16th. So sign up and, you know, we can talk about evaluation. We can talk about your projects, whatever you want, super informal conversation. And so some other events coming up is your consultation. You can schedule that at any time. There's a link in the chat and you just basically sign up. We have a very brief conversation. And then we talk about what resource team members you might want to work with. And that's, it's really very, very informal. You don't have to come with a proposal or plan. It could just be a question, a thought, an idea. And then we have a very special event coming up on December 7th at 2 p.m. And that is a public event open to all. It's a conversation with NEA Chair Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson. And she's going to share her reflections on what it means to build an arts-infused civic infrastructure in light of this historic moment of federal investment. So we're going to be bringing in 2 other Our Town grantees to talk about their projects. One is Ideas X Lab, and the other is Asian Arts Initiative, along with Friends of the Rail Park. So here's a pro tip. If you are looking to engage some of your colleagues and friends and potential partners and helping them to kind of think more intentionally about what creative placemaking is or about your work, invite them to this event because it'll inspire, it'll help them kind of see the vision of our town. And then lastly, we are always trying to make our program you know, better serve our grantees and creative placemakers like you. So we're going to put in the chat, we're putting up a poll that we'd love to hear, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So please take a minute to complete this poll. And we'll be sharing more information. Yes. Hello?
Oh, Melissa, I'm sorry. I was just going to say there was a question in the chat. While they're answering that, for me to grab that, Tony asked, a theme seems to be that community narratives are far more powerful than traditional data. What are some key strategies to convince others of this approach? So wonderful question. And I would, just as a quick reply, I would say that the thing that you want to do is find the most powerful approach for the specific audience that you're dealing with. So if your audience, to your specific audience, whomever that is, if community narratives are the most powerful way to reach them, then you won't have to convince them that that's the most powerful way to reach them. Just use that, right? If there are other people that you're developing community narratives and you want people to honor those narratives who are not honoring them yet, there may be other ways to do that. So if you have a specific audience and you know that all that they care about, I will also say the community narratives are a form of traditional data. They're older than some of the quantified forms that we have, but I totally understand what you mean. If you do have some audience that's really only interested in numbers and quantifiable things and stuff like that, there are ways to, like, you know, you could provide a report that includes some of that, but then also provide some of the narratives. And I will say, like in my work with Project Uncaged, a lot of times the wardens of a jail or other people who are deciding whether to bring this program in, they want my statistics, but to be honest, as soon as I hand them a book, I just have learned to be quiet because they're not listening to me anymore. They're just reading the book. So sometimes you just need to give them both, give them what they think they want, but then also give them the thing that you know is powerful. And then that might shift their perspective. I hope that's helpful.
So,
hey, I have a question.
Yes.
Hey, how's it going? Sorry. My name is Joshua Florian Beltre, and I work for the City of Lancaster, Department of Neighborhood Engagement. And I work specifically for the art department. And we recently got your art grant awarded to us for a project that we have under the name PACE, which is Public Art Community Engagement, which is an opportunity for artists to keep artists to partner with local government to elevate concerns, ideas, or challenges, and addressing them through community art projects. And then under that umbrella, we have a cohort of 5 artists that get a year and a half of creative and professional development that teaches artists how to infuse community and civic engagement into their creative practice. The artists in the cohort are provided this grant funding to develop individual projects within their communities, as well as a group exhibition that is a culmination of all the artists here together at F&M College in their gallery. So now we're in the end of this cohort by April of next year. The artists will be showing their art at F&M Phillips Museum from January to April. So if you're ever in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, please come by and check it out. And my question to you is, I would love to go talk to the or attend the chairman event December 7th. And I wanted to see if I can show you guys, or if there's an opportunity for me to show you what the artists here in Lancaster have been doing this past year and a half with the grant that was funded from your organization. I've only been in here for about a month and a half, so everything is pretty new for me. So right now I'm in a learning curve where I just want to input myself in every situation and possible opportunity to further advance my knowledge, my wisdom, and hopefully get some great guidance on the way.
Thanks, Josh. I think given that we're running so short on time, the best thing might be for you to sign up for a consultation, and we can have a longer conversation about the many ways that we could be working together to help you make the most of your Our Town experience.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank our presenters and our resource team members for a really rigorous and deep session. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon at another event.